Now, one of the things that I think fits into that discussion, if we are to nail it some aspects down a bit more, is a lot of people talk about Kant's first critique and his, I suppose, Copernican revolution in philosophy. Can you tell us a bit about how, I suppose, the framework that you've just discussed fits into that Copernican revolution?
So the Copernican revolution is Copernicus switched from a geocentric standpoint to a heliocentric standpoint. And I think the crucial thing there is that it's a gestalt shift in the way we look at the world. I mean, there's a sort of disanalogy with Copernicus in the sense that Kant is saying that we should shift from either classical rationalist or empiricist standpoint to a transcendental idealist standpoint, which puts us front and center. But it's, again, a gestalt shift. And in any case, the gestalt shift in this sense is instead of assuming that our minds passively respond and conform to the way things outside it are, whether noumenal things or merely phenomenal things, we postulate instead that the world conforms to us. And so, so it's that, that the Copernican revolution consists principally in what I'm calling the conformity thesis, together with the idealism thesis, which is that our knowledge and cognition are always and only of appearances or phenomena, never things in themselves or noumena.
And perhaps can you talk a bit more about that picture of transcendental idealism and the distinction that he's making between the things in themselves and the phenomena?
Yeah, and so this is one of the most controversial parts, as you know, of Kant's philosophy and of Kantian philosophy more generally, and that is, so Kant says there is a distinction between objects conceived independently of any relation to human sensory experience, and then objects that are only within human sensory experience and dependent, and to that extent on it. The question is whether things in themselves actually exist. We can't know their nature, right? The only things we can know the natures of are things as they're presented to us in appearances and then our own minds. But the question is, do things in themselves really exist outside of us and have mysterious causal powers of various kinds? Things in themselves which might include God, as Kant says, the freedom of the will, immortality of the human soul, the existence of souls. Can they really be known and exist independently of us? And my take is we should be completely agnostic about that. In other words, we don't know enough about them. We can describe them in a minimal, way, but we can't give them the full flesh of empirical meaningfulness. And so we can't prove, we can't know what their nature is, and we can't prove that they exist or do not exist. And therefore we should remain fully agnostic. The result of the agnostic, I call that radical agnosticism. We know a priori that we can't know the nature of things in themselves or prove their existence one way or the other, or non-existence. Therefore, we should focus our metaphysics and focus our philosophical thinking on the things that we really can know, namely appearances, outer appearances, or inner appearances, the operations of our minds, and do philosophy, go forward in philosophy, using those as our starting points and as our checkpoints for evidence and so on. So on the other hand, people often think of Kant as a kind of indirect realist, postulates that noumena exist or things in themselves, that they cause us, even though we don't know how. But it seems to me that leads to skepticism, since how could we know whether they exist or not if we don't even know enough about them to be able to, is this is a thing in itself lurking around in my study? Couldn't say one way or the other. So we ought to, this is what I call methodological eliminativism about things in themselves, is that we should just leave them out of account and focus on the things we actually can focus on. If that's done, then it makes it possible to say, this is the real world, the manifestly real world. So it doesn't degrade the world of appearances to say that, they belong within human experiences. human experience. And so an appearance is, a veridical concept for me. I mean, there are illusions, but you can, if you say it appears that there's a coffee cup in, Bob Hanna's study, that's true. I mean, or if a detective says, oh, it appears that, the butler is really the murderer, that means the butler really is the murderer. Or someone appears at the door, they really do appear at the door. So there is a sense of appearance, which means, as the phenomenologist later said, showing itself from what it is, that's what it is. That's its essence, is to show itself in that way. And so we can be empirical, what Kant calls empirical realists, even at the same time as we're transcendental idealists. So it's not that we're caught in a subjective, veiled, net. Rather, here's the world, here we are, here are the appearances. Some of them mislead us and some of them don't. We need to, in science, we're looking for the ones that don't mislead us. And truth is the correspondence of our representations to the way the world, manifestly appears or is manifestly real. And so we can go forward with a realistic view, but it's also idealist in the sense of the conformity thesis. So it's, and it's, if it's the case that the manifestly real world does conform to the nature of our minds, then our minds can never be wholly unrelated. A certain kind of global skepticism whereby, things could show themselves the way that they do, and yet the world might be wholly different from the way it shows itself, cannot happen, because the way things show themselves to us has to be pre-formatted for us. And so, this is a fully non-skeptical position.